I never thought the person who would destroy my marriage would be my own mother. If a stranger had done it, I could have walked away and never looked back. But when the lies came from the woman who raised me, it felt like I was fighting someone who already knew every weak spot I had. The worst part wasn't losing my wife. It was realizing that almost every painful moment in my life had been carefully planned by the same person. By the time I uncovered my mother's biggest secret, my marriage was already over, and half my family refused to speak to me. Looking back now, I can see every warning sign. I just didn't know what narcissism looked like until it was too late. I'm 32 now, but this story really started when I was a kid. My father worked long hours and stayed out of every argument. My mother made every decision in the house. She always said she sacrificed everything for me and reminded me of it almost every day. If I got a good grade, she would tell everyone it happened because of her parenting. If I failed at something, she would quietly remind me that I embarrassed the family. I grew up believing love had to be earned. Nothing I did ever felt good enough. When I was 16, I noticed something strange. Every friend I became close to eventually stopped calling me. At first, I blamed myself. Years later, one of those friends admitted my mother had called his parents and told them I was getting involved with drugs. None of it was true. She simply didn't like that I was spending less time at home. That should have been the moment I understood who she really was. Instead, I forgave her because she cried and said she only wanted to protect me. College gave me my first taste of freedom. I moved 2 hours away and finally felt like I could breathe. I made friends without anyone interfering. I started building a career in software, and for the first time I imagined a future that belonged to me instead of my family. My mother called every single day. If I missed one call, she left voice messages saying she was worried something terrible had happened. When I answered, she would ask why I didn't love her anymore. The guilt always worked. I never realized it was control, dressed up as concern. Then I met Emily. She wasn't loud or dramatic. She volunteered at an animal shelter on weekends and laughed at the smallest things. We met because she accidentally picked up my coffee at a local cafe and spent 10 minutes apologizing even though it wasn't a big deal. We talked for an hour that day, then had dinner the next weekend. Everything felt easy with her. There were no games, no emotional tests, and no endless drama. Being with Emily felt peaceful, and I didn't know how rare that was. After a year together, I decided it was time for her to meet my parents. I was nervous, but I kept telling myself my mother would be happy for me. Emily even brought flowers because she wanted to make a good first impression. My mother smiled the second she opened the door. She hugged Emily, complimented her dress, and spent the whole evening acting like the perfect future mother-in-law. On the drive home, Emily said I was lucky because my mom seemed so kind and welcoming. I wanted to believe that too. A few days later, my mother called while I was at work. She sounded calm but disappointed. She said she liked Emily but noticed something strange. According to her, Emily had looked around the house like she was judging everything. She claimed Emily barely touched the dinner because she thought our family wasn't good enough. None of it matched what I remembered. I laughed and told my mother she must have misunderstood. She didn't argue. She simply said she hoped I wasn't too blinded by love to see the truth. That sentence stayed in my head longer than I wanted to admit. Over the next few weeks, little comments started appearing from nowhere. My mother would casually mention that Emily seemed controlling or distant or too interested in my salary. They were never direct accusations. Just tiny seeds planted one after another. Every time I defended Emily, my mother smiled and changed the subject. Looking back, I realized she never tried to convince me. She only wanted me to question my own judgment. One Sunday, Emily looked at me during dinner and asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Can I ask you something without you getting upset?" I nodded. She looked nervous before quietly saying, "Why does your mom keep asking me if I'm planning to leave you one day?" The room suddenly felt colder, because my mother had never mentioned asking Emily anything like that. The drive home was almost silent. I kept thinking there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe my mother was only trying to understand Emily better. Maybe Emily misunderstood the question. I wanted both women to be right, because the other option was something I was not ready to face. The next morning, I called my mom during my lunch break. I asked if she had really been asking Emily whether she planned to leave me. She laughed before I even finished speaking. Then she said Emily was being dramatic. According to her, she had only asked one harmless question about relationships because she cared about my future. She ended the call by saying something that stayed in my mind all day. "Be careful, son. Some women love attention more than they love the man." That evening, Emily admitted there was more she had not told me. She said my mother had been texting her almost every week since they first met. At first, the messages were sweet. She would send recipes, funny pictures, and family memories. Then the tone slowly changed. She started asking personal questions. Did we ever argue? Was I good with money? Did I get angry when I was stressed? Emily answered politely because she wanted a good relationship with my family. A few days later, my mother crossed another line. She told Emily that I had always struggled with commitment. She claimed I had almost proposed to another woman years earlier but backed out because I was afraid of marriage. None of that had ever happened. Emily did not believe her, but she wondered why anyone would invent a story like that. I felt embarrassed more than angry. I apologized to Emily even though I had done nothing wrong. She held my hand and told me we would handle it together. That should have made me feel better. Instead, I felt guilty for bringing this chaos into her life. I decided to set a boundary. That weekend, I visited my parents alone. I calmly told my mother that my relationship with Emily was my business, and I wanted her to stop asking personal questions or sending messages that made Emily uncomfortable. She did not yell. She did not argue. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? She has already turned you against your own mother." I had seen that reaction my entire life. The conversation instantly became about her pain instead of my concern. Before I could respond, my father quietly stood up and walked into the garage like he always did whenever she became emotional. 2 days later, my aunt called me. She sounded worried. She asked if everything was okay between me and Emily because my mother had been telling relatives that our relationship was falling apart. I almost dropped my phone. We had never told anyone about our private conversations. As far as I knew, everything between Emily and me was still strong. When I confronted my mother, she acted confused. "I was only asking the family to pray for you," she said. I never said anything bad. But somehow every relative had heard a different version. One believed Emily was controlling me. Another thought she refused to have children. Someone else heard she wanted me to cut off my parents forever. The lies kept changing depending on who my mother was talking to. Emily started avoiding family dinners because every visit left her exhausted. She felt like she was constantly defending herself against accusations nobody would repeat directly to her face. Every smile around the table felt fake. One night she looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I don't think your mother wants me in this family." I wanted to tell her she was wrong. I wanted to promise everything would get better. But for the first time in my life, I couldn't honestly say those words. A week later, I proposed anyway. Not because everything was perfect. Because I loved Emily, and I believed that once we were married, my mother would finally accept that our relationship was permanent. I had no idea that my proposal was the moment my mother decided to stop playing small games. She was about to start a plan that would destroy my marriage before it even had a chance to survive. The night after our engagement should have been one of the happiest nights of my life. Emily kept staring at the ring and smiling every few minutes. We started talking about wedding venues, guest lists, and where we wanted to spend our honeymoon. For the first time in years, I felt like my future was finally my own. That feeling lasted less than 48 hours. My mother called me early Saturday morning. She sounded excited and insisted we come over because she wanted to celebrate with the family. Emily wasn't sure it was a good idea after everything that had happened, but I convinced her to give my parents one more chance. The house was full when we arrived. My aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents were already there. My mother greeted Emily with a hug so warm that even I started believing things had changed. For a few hours, everything felt normal. Then, little things began happening. Every time Emily walked into another room, my mother quietly pulled a different relative aside. They would whisper for a minute, then glance toward Emily before looking away. At first, I ignored it. By the end of the afternoon, I noticed almost everyone acting differently around her. My cousin Jake finally pulled me aside. He looked uncomfortable. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. He lowered his voice. "Is Emily really making you sign a prenup that gives her everything if you divorce?" I stared at him. "What are you talking about?" Jake frowned. Aunt Linda told everyone she overheard Emily talking about it. I felt my stomach tighten. Emily had never even mentioned a prenup. Not once. I walked straight into the kitchen where my mother was serving dessert. I asked her where that story came from. She looked genuinely offended. "I never said that. People hear one thing and turn it into something else. You know how families gossip." There was no proof. No witness willing to speak up. Just another lie that somehow had no owner. On the drive home, Emily cried quietly while looking out the window. "I smiled at everyone today," she whispered. "Why do they all look at me like I'm using you?" I didn't know what to say, because I was asking myself the same question. Over the next month, the wedding planning became harder than the relationship itself. Every florist my mother recommended somehow ended up calling Emily difficult. A venue manager suddenly claimed Emily had been rude on the phone, even though she had never spoken to him. One caterer canceled after saying there was too much family drama. It felt like invisible hands were pushing pieces across a board while we watched everything fall apart. Then, something happened that changed everything. Emily received a message from a woman she had never met. The woman apologized for contacting her, but said she couldn't stay quiet anymore. Attached to the message were screenshots. They showed weeks of conversations with my mother. In those messages, my mother described Emily as manipulative, greedy, emotionally unstable, and someone who would leave my son once she got what she wanted. The woman explained she was the sister of one of the wedding vendors. My mother had been trying to convince local businesses that Emily was impossible to work with. Emily handed me the phone without saying a word. My hands were shaking as I read every message. There it was. Actual proof. Not rumors. Not misunderstandings. My own mother had been secretly trying to ruin our wedding. I drove straight to my parents' house. For the first time in my life, I didn't care if we argued. I walked inside holding my phone and placed it on the kitchen table. Explain this. My mother barely looked at the screenshots. Instead, she looked at me. Then, she smiled. A slow, calm smile. I was only protecting you. Those 6 words hit harder than any apology ever could. She truly believed she had done nothing wrong. Or maybe, she simply didn't care. Before I could answer, my father quietly spoke from the other side of the room. It was only one sentence, but it completely changed the way I saw my entire childhood. He looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Son, this isn't the first woman she's done this to." My heart stopped, because I had never told him about the other girlfriends. So, how did he know? I slowly turned toward my father, convinced I had heard him wrong. What do you mean this isn't the first woman? He looked at my mother for a long moment before lowering his eyes. I mean exactly what I said. The room went completely quiet. For years, my father had stayed out of every argument. He always disappeared into the garage, went outside, or pretended he hadn't heard anything. I honestly believed he knew very little about what was happening. I was wrong. He knew almost everything. He just never stopped it. My mother crossed her arms and laughed. Don't start rewriting history. My father ignored her. When you were in college, there was a girl named Hannah. I nodded slowly. Hannah suddenly stopped answering my calls. He took a deep breath. She didn't leave because she lost interest. Your mother met her without telling you. I felt my chest tighten. What? She told Hannah that mental illness ran in our family. She said you had violent mood swings and that marriage with you would ruin her life. I couldn't speak. I had blamed myself for losing Hannah for almost 10 years. I spent months wondering what I had done wrong. The truth had been sitting in my parents' house the entire time. Before I could process that, my father continued. Then there was Olivia, another name I hadn't heard in years. Your mother called Olivia's parents and convinced them you were secretly drowning in debt. That relationship ended only a week later. I remembered begging Olivia to tell me what had changed. She only cried and said our future didn't make sense anymore. Now I finally knew why. I looked at my mother. She didn't deny any of it. She simply shrugged. They weren't right for you. I stared at her in disbelief. You destroyed years of my life. I saved years of your life. She answered so confidently that it almost sounded reasonable. That was the terrifying part. She truly believed she owned every important decision in my life. Emily had quietly walked into the house during the conversation. She had followed me because she was worried things would get out of control. She heard everything. Every word. Every confession. She looked at my mother with tears in her eyes. I spent months thinking there was something wrong with me. My mother barely looked at her. I was trying to protect my son. Emily asked the simplest question anyone had asked that day. From what? My mother answered without hesitation. From losing me. Nobody spoke. Even my father closed his eyes. That single sentence explained everything. It was never about Emily. It wasn't about Hannah, or Olivia, or any other woman. My mother believed every serious relationship was stealing me away from her. Anyone who became important to me automatically became her enemy. I finally understood why nothing in my life had ever been allowed to belong only to me. That night I left my parents' house knowing things would never be the same. For the first time, I blocked my mother's number. I removed her from every social media account. I told my father he could contact me whenever he wanted, but only if it had nothing to do with her. For the next few weeks, life became strangely peaceful. Then one afternoon, Emily received another message. This one wasn't from my mother. It was from someone whose name neither of us recognized. The message contained only one sentence. If you really want to know why your mother-in-law is so desperate to keep her son single, ask her about the year 1998. There was no explanation, no signature, just that one sentence. I showed it to my father that evening. The color disappeared from his face. He whispered 3 words I will never forget. Don't investigate that. The fear in his voice told me one thing. Whatever happened in 1998, it was much bigger than I had ever imagined. I couldn't stop thinking about that message. Ask her about the year 1998. It played in my head while I worked, while I tried to sleep, even while Emily and I were eating dinner. Every time I looked at my father, I remembered the fear on his face. That wasn't the reaction of someone hiding a small family argument. He looked like a man protecting a secret that had been buried for decades. Emily finally asked the question I had been avoiding. Are you actually going to find out what happened? I looked at her. If my mother has spent years lying to everyone around her, I deserve to know what else she's hiding. A few days later, my father called me from a number I didn't recognize. He sounded nervous. Can we meet somewhere your mother won't know about? We met at a small diner, nearly an hour away from my parents' neighborhood. He kept looking over his shoulder, as if someone might be watching him. For several minutes, he barely touched his coffee. Finally, he spoke. Your mother wasn't always like this. I frowned. What changed? He stared at the table. Control became more important to her than love. That wasn't really an answer. I asked him again, about 1998. He sighed. I can't tell you everything. Why not? Because it isn't only my secret. Before I could ask another question, he reached into his jacket and slid an old envelope across the table. It was worn out, slightly torn, and sealed with yellowing tape. I've kept this for almost 30 years. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were copies of old letters, a few photographs, and a newspaper clipping. The newspaper article was about a local charity fundraiser from 1998. At first it looked completely unrelated. Then I noticed one photograph. My mother was standing beside a man I had never seen before. They looked close, much closer than strangers. My father quietly explained. His name was Daniel. Who was he? He didn't answer immediately. Finally he whispered. He was the man your mother wanted to marry before she met me. I looked back at the picture. She wasn't simply standing next to him. She was looking at him the same way Emily looked at me. There was genuine happiness in her face. Something I had honestly never seen while growing up. So what happened? My father took a deep breath. Daniel ended the relationship. Why? He realized how controlling she had become. The words hit me like a truck. Control. The same pattern. Even back then. My father continued. After Daniel left, your mother completely fell apart. She couldn't accept that someone had chosen to leave her. From that day on, she became obsessed with making sure nobody she loved could ever leave again. Suddenly, everything started making sense. Every phone call, every lie, every attempt to isolate me. She wasn't protecting me. She was protecting herself from being abandoned again. But one question still didn't have an answer. What does any of this have to do with 1998? My father looked away. It wasn't the breakup. What was it then? He hesitated so long that I thought he had changed his mind. Then he quietly said, Daniel disappeared from everyone's life, only 3 months later. I blinked. What do you mean disappeared? He packed his things, left town, and never spoke to anyone here again. That's normal. My father slowly shook his head. No. He left behind his business. His house. His friends. Even his younger sister had no idea where he went. I stared at him. Are you saying my mother had something to do with it? He immediately answered. I don't know, but I've spent 28 years wondering. As I left the diner, I realized something that made my stomach turn. I wasn't just trying to understand why my mother ruined my marriage anymore. I was beginning to question whether I had ever truly known the woman who raised me. And later that same night, someone broke into my apartment. Nothing expensive was taken. The TV was still there. My laptop was untouched. Cash was still inside the bedroom drawer. Only one thing was missing. The old envelope my father had given me. And whoever took it wanted me to know they had been there. Because lying on my kitchen table was a single handwritten note. Stop digging. I stood there staring at the note for what felt like forever. Stop digging. The apartment door showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing valuable was missing, except the envelope my father had trusted me with only a few hours earlier. Emily slowly walked through every room. My jewelry is still here. My laptop too. She looked at me with fear in her eyes. Whoever came here wasn't stealing. They were looking for that envelope. I wanted to call the police immediately. But what was I supposed to tell them? Someone had broken in and stolen a stack of old papers connected to a family secret. It sounded unbelievable. Still, I filed a report. The officer was polite, but I could tell he didn't expect much to come from it. That night, neither of us slept. Every small sound outside made us sit up in bed. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel safe in my own home. The next morning I called my father. He answered on the first ring. They took it, didn't they? My heart sank. You already knew. He stayed silent. How? Because it happened to me once. Those words changed everything. What are you talking about? A few years after I hid those papers, someone broke into our old house. What did they take? Nothing. Except the original photographs. I leaned against the kitchen counter. You never told the police? I did. They couldn't prove anything. I asked him the question that had been bothering me since the diner. Do you think Mom did this? He took several seconds before answering. I honestly don't know anymore. That afternoon I received a call from an unknown number. A woman's voice asked if I was Daniel's son. I immediately said no. She apologized and almost hung up. Then she stopped herself. Wait, aren't you Linda's son? My stomach tightened. Yes. She became very quiet. I've been looking for your family for years. She introduced herself as Claire, Daniel's younger sister, the same sister my father had mentioned. She said she had found my name through an old social media post after recognizing my mother's picture from a family event someone had shared online. I asked the question that mattered most. Do you know what happened to your brother? She sighed. No, but I know the last person who threatened him. I closed my eyes. I already knew the answer. My mother? Yes. Claire explained that weeks before Daniel disappeared, he had told her he was ending all contact with my mother because she refused to accept the breakup. She constantly appeared at his workplace. She called him dozens of times every day. She even contacted women he dated after her. One evening he came home terrified. According to Claire, he said something she had never forgotten. If anything strange happens to me, don't believe Linda. I felt cold, all over. There was still no evidence my mother had committed any crime. But every new piece of information painted the same picture. A woman who couldn't handle rejection. A woman who believed love meant ownership. A woman who destroyed relationships instead of accepting their end. When I told Emily about the phone call, she quietly sat beside me. Then she asked something I hadn't allowed myself to think about. What if she never changes? I didn't answer, because deep down, I already knew she wouldn't. Later that evening, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mother. The first one since I blocked her. I still have no idea how she got my new number. It contained only one sentence. Families should never expose each other's secrets. Then another message arrived a few seconds later, especially when those secrets can destroy everyone. I stared at the screen. For the first time, it didn't feel like guilt. It felt like a warning. And at that moment, I made a decision. If my mother wanted to hide the truth for the rest of her life, I was going to bring it into the light. No matter who got hurt, after reading my mother's messages, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to argue with her anymore. I wasn't going to beg her to tell the truth. From that moment on, I was only interested in facts. Emily agreed with me on one condition. If this starts destroying your peace again, we walk away. I promised her I would. A promise I truly believed I could keep. The first person I visited was my grandmother. My mother's mother. She was in her late 80s and had recently moved into an assisted living community. Unlike everyone else in the family, she had never taken sides in any argument. When I mentioned my mother's name, she smiled sadly. You finally figured it out, didn't you? That sentence caught me completely off guard. You knew? She nodded slowly. I knew she always needed to be the center of everyone's life. I asked why nobody had stopped her. My grandmother looked exhausted. We tried. Nothing ever changed. She explained that even as a teenager, my mother couldn't accept being ignored. If one of her friends became close to someone else, she would spread rumors until the friendship ended. If a family member received attention, she would suddenly create a crisis that pulled everyone back to her. According to my grandmother, it only became worse after Daniel left. Something inside her changed. She stopped trusting love. Instead, she started trying to control it. Before I left, My grandmother handed me an old photo album. "You should have this." Inside were dozens of family pictures. Most of them were ordinary. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, school graduations. But one picture made me stop. It showed my wedding engagement dinner. Not the official photo. A candid picture someone had taken from across the room. My mother wasn't looking at Emily. She wasn't looking at me either. She was staring directly at the engagement ring. Her expression wasn't happiness. It wasn't pride. It looked like anger. Pure anger. Emily noticed it too. I've never seen anyone look at an engagement ring like that. That evening, I received a call from my cousin Jake. He sounded nervous. "I think I owe you an apology." We met at a nearby park. Jake admitted that my mother had been telling relatives stories about Emily for almost a year. Whenever someone questioned her, she cried. She claimed she was only trying to save me from making the biggest mistake of my life. And we believed her, Jake admitted. She was your mom. It never crossed our minds that she could be making it all up. Then he showed me something unexpected. Months earlier, my mother had accidentally sent him a voice message instead of another relative. She quickly deleted it. But Jake had already downloaded it. He handed me his phone. I pressed play. My mother's voice filled the speakers. "Don't tell him everything at once. If everyone gives him little pieces, he'll start doubting Emily himself." I froze. Emily looked at me in complete disbelief. There it was. Not a misunderstanding. Not gossip. An actual plan. She had been coordinating family members to slowly turn me against the woman I loved. Jake looked ashamed. I didn't understand what she meant back then. I thanked him and saved a copy of the recording. For the first time, I had evidence that couldn't be explained away. That night I called every relative my mother had spoken to. Some refused to answer. Others admitted she had told them different stories about Emily. One by one, the pattern became obvious. She had tailored every lie to fit the person she was speaking to. To my aunt, Emily was greedy. To my uncle, she was disrespectful. To my cousins, she was controlling. To my grandparents, she planned to isolate me from the family. Each lie was different, but they all had the same goal. Make everyone distrust Emily. When I showed the recording to my father, he didn't seem surprised. Instead, he quietly walked upstairs. A few minutes later, he came back carrying a small metal box. I've been hiding these for years. Inside were printed emails, handwritten notes, birthday cards, and several pages of therapy journals my mother had written years earlier before she stopped going to counseling. One sentence was underlined in red ink. "If my son loves another woman more than he loves me, I've already lost." I looked at my father. He finally broke down. With tears running down his face, he whispered, "I should have protected you." That was the first time in my entire life I saw my father cry. And in that moment, I realized something. Exposing my mother's biggest secret wasn't going to destroy just one person. It was about to tear my entire family apart. For 3 days, I didn't call anyone. I spent every spare hour organizing everything we had found. The screenshots, the voice recording, the text messages, the emails, my father's notes. Every piece told the same story from a different angle. By themselves, they looked like misunderstandings. Together, they showed years of calculated manipulation. Emily watched me spread everything across our dining table. She gently placed her hand over mine. "You don't have to do this." "I know. But if I stay quiet, she'll do it to someone else." Emily nodded. She understood. A week later, my aunt called and invited everyone to my grandparents' anniversary dinner. Almost the entire family was going to be there. Normally, I would have said no. This time, I said yes. The restaurant was full of laughter when we arrived. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. My mother acted exactly the way she always did. She hugged everyone. She complimented people. She laughed louder than anyone else. If you didn't know her, you would have thought she was the sweetest woman in the room. Then my grandmother stood up. She thanked everyone for coming and asked if anyone wanted to say a few words. I slowly pushed my chair back. The room became quiet. "I'd like to say something." My mother smiled proudly. She probably thought I was about to thank my parents. Instead, I connected my phone to the restaurant's Bluetooth speaker. The first thing everyone heard was her own voice. "Don't tell him everything at once. If everyone gives him little pieces, he'll start doubting Emily himself." The room went completely silent. My mother immediately stood up. "Turn that off." I didn't move. Then, I showed the screenshots of her messages about Emily. Next came the emails. Then the texts she had sent to relatives, one after another. Each lie, each rumor, each attempt to destroy my relationship. Nobody interrupted. Nobody defended her. For the first time in my life, she had nowhere to hide. My aunt quietly admitted that my mother had warned her not to trust Emily. My uncle confessed he had heard a completely different story. Jake admitted he had been part of the manipulation without realizing it. One by one, every family member realized they had each been told a different version of the truth. My mother looked around the room. She saw the confusion, the disappointment, the disbelief. Then she did exactly what she had always done. She started crying. I only wanted to protect my son. Nobody answered. Not even my father. She looked directly at him. Say something. He slowly stood up. For years he had remained silent. This time, he didn't. He looked around the room before quietly saying, No, you weren't protecting him. You were protecting yourself. The restaurant became so quiet that I could hear dishes being placed in the kitchen. My father continued, You didn't ruin one relationship. You ruined every relationship he ever had. Then he looked at me. I'm sorry, I was too afraid to stop it. My mother stared at him as if she had never seen him before. She demanded that everyone leave with her. Nobody moved. For the first time, she wasn't controlling the room anymore. She grabbed her purse and walked toward the exit. Just before reaching the door, she turned around. I honestly expected an apology. Instead, she looked directly at Emily. If you really loved him, you would have left years ago. Then she walked out. Emily didn't cry. She didn't respond. She simply reached for my hand. That was the moment I realized my mother had finally lost the one thing she had spent years trying to control. Me. I thought everything was over. I was wrong. Because 2 days later, my lawyer called. And what he told me proved my mother still had one final move left. When my lawyer called, I assumed my mother was threatening to sue me for embarrassing her in front of the family. Instead, he said something I never expected. Your mother has filed a petition claiming you're being manipulated by your fiancé and that you're mentally unfit to make financial decisions. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. According to the paperwork, she wanted the court to question whether I was making decisions under undue influence. She claimed Emily had isolated me from my family and convinced me to spread false accusations. It was the same story, just with a different audience. This time, she wasn't trying to convince relatives. She was trying to convince strangers. Thankfully, the petition had almost nothing supporting it. The screenshots, the voice recording, the text messages. Everything we had collected told a very different story. A few weeks later, the petition was dismissed. The judge didn't see any evidence that supported my mother's claims. When I walked out of the courthouse, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt tired. For nearly 2 years, my entire life had revolved around defending myself against someone who was supposed to love me. After that day, something unexpected happened. Family members started reaching out one by one. My aunt apologized for believing the rumors. Jake admitted he should have told me about the voice message much earlier. Even relatives who had ignored me for months finally admitted they had been manipulated. None of those apologies gave me back my marriage. Because while Emily and I had survived my mother's lies, the damage had still been real. Months of stress, constant arguments, living with suspicion, always looking over our shoulders. One evening, Emily sat beside me on our apartment balcony. She looked at the sunset before quietly saying, I don't want your mother to control our future the way she controlled our past. That sentence changed everything. A month later, we got married. Not in a huge ballroom. Not with hundreds of guests. Just 23 people. The ones who had supported us when everything fell apart. There were no speeches about perfect families. No fake smiles. No unnecessary drama. It was the happiest day of my life, because it was finally peaceful. My father came alone. Before the ceremony started, he hugged me longer than he ever had before. He whispered, I'm proud of the man you became. I smiled. I wish you'd said that years ago. He nodded. So do I. As for my mother, she wasn't invited. She tried calling from different numbers. She mailed letters. She even asked relatives to convince me to forgive her. I read every letter. Not one of them contained the words, I'm sorry. Every page blamed someone else. Emily, my father, me, the family, anyone except herself. That told me everything I needed to know. People often ask if I hate my mother. The truth is, I don't. Hatred still creates a connection. I simply accepted that some people will never admit the harm they've caused, no matter how much evidence is placed in front of them. It's been 3 years now. Emily and I are expecting our first child. When I found out I was going to be a father, I made one promise to myself. My child will never have to earn my love. They will never wonder whether affection depends on obedience. They will never grow up believing guilt is the same thing as family. Sometimes I still think about my mother. I wonder if she tells people I'm the ungrateful son who abandoned her. Maybe she does. Maybe she truly believes it. I can't control the story she tells other people. I can only control the life I choose to live. Some relatives still think I should forgive her because she's your mother. Others believe cutting contact was the healthiest decision I ever made. So now I'm asking all of you, after everything she did, would you ever give someone like that a second chance? Just because they're family?